Okay, while everybody's getting assembled up here, I'd like to introduce myself first and thank you for joining us for this panel. I'm Jerry Christensen with Mind Commerce, and we cover IoT in a lot of different ways, including privacy and security, which I had an opportunity to provide a presentation yesterday and be part of the panel as part of the pre-show fog computing discussion. And I'm very interested in hearing what this esteemed panel has to say, which I think is probably going to go above and beyond what we talked about yesterday, because we're talking about that in this particular panel, the frameworks for security in a broader context. So I think what I'd like to do first before we go into some prepared questions that I have and whatever comments that the panel would like to make, I'd like to give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves. So we'll start from my immediate left.
Hello, I'm Mike Tenafos. I'm a representative of the Industrial Internet Consortium, as well as Aruba Networks, which is a Hewlett-Packard enterprise company. We have a very broad initiative underway, both in the consortium as well as within Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, to provide a trustful Internet of Things, where today it's basically untrustworthy. So how do you assert trust both on new devices as well as on the billions of legacy devices that really don't have the intelligence in them to be able to support modern security mechanisms?
Hi everybody, I'm Paul Pluffjohn. I work at ADT down in Boca Raton, Florida. We are, if you don't know who we are, we're the country's largest alarm company and home automation company. Our footprint in this space is we have about 7 million customers in the US and Canada, of which we have about 1.6 million now using our smart technologies to extend their idea of security into home automation. And it's also the largest group that we, for our new customers, it's far and away the largest area our customers are interested in. I think the stats today are like almost 7 out of 10 customers that we bring on one of our Pulse platform technologies. And I'm looking forward to talking with you. I found today's previous panels to be on the mark, and looking forward to this panel.
My name is Ted Harrington. I'm one of the owners of a company called Independent Security Evaluators. We're information security consultants and researchers. Basically, organizations hire us to kind of hack away at their products and find weaknesses. We do a lot of security research. We were the first company to hack iPhone. We're the first company to hack Android operating system. Diebold, which makes the e-voting machines that everyone will be using come November. We hacked those. More recently, we uncovered the vulnerability epidemic that's happening in wireless routers. We also organized some pretty cool hacking events, one of which is IoT Village, which is the newest village at the esteemed security conference, DevCon. And basically in that, what we do is organize a lot of really smart people to look at connected devices, find security flaws in them, and help articulate how to solve the problem. And if there's one takeaway that we've learned from that, and I think we'll talk about this probably a little bit more, but the issues that you see in connected devices are systemic. It's not any one manufacturer is doing things wrong. It's that all of these connected devices are looking at how to build connectivity in their devices in the wrong way. So with that, I know what's coming.
All right, so I think you hacked my home. My name is Scott Amyx, and I'm the founder CEO of Amyx Plus and managing partner at Venture First. I've contributed to a couple of academic journals on the topic of privacy and security, and have regularly spoken on this topic. And from my perspective, the area that I like to focus today is the recurring theme that I hear from these conferences on this topic is, especially for SMBs and smaller startups, it's difficult to have the resources and the budget and the know-how to actually be able to implement some of the fundamentals as well as some of the extensions. So the areas that I'm going to be focusing on is really kind of the how, the building blocks for both the small startup, but also the SMBs and even larger firms, how they can start to take advantage of open source as well as some of the latest technology that's up and coming.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, panel. So my intent is that hopefully we'll answer as many questions as possible as what you see up there that we intend to answer. And I know the panel has some prepared things that they'd like to discuss. So before I ask them some prepared questions, before we turn it over to Q&A, I'd like to give them the opportunity to do that. So which one of you would like to step up first and make sure you get in with a few comments that you definitely want to make sure that you have a chance to do? Okay, they're all looking at each other, so I'll ask some questions. All right, very good. I'm sure they'll come up eventually, though. All right, so one thing that kind of hits me is the whole issue of privacy versus security, because they're not exactly the same thing, at least not in my mind anyway, and they bring up different implications. So I think I'd like to turn that back over to the panel. We'll go in reverse order. So Scott, tell me what you see as some of the big issues in privacy and security, and maybe some areas where there's overlap, where there's some similar issues.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest confusion is really with the consumer mindset. They tend to befuddle and commingle the two topics, but though there's some correlation, they're fundamentally different. Privacy, and there's many different ways that we can define privacy, from surveillance, but it's all about basically as you create and generate data, and data is generated about you, how do you ensure that data ownership resides with you and not proprietary services like the Dropbox, like the Google, and some of these IoT manufacturers? So that's a real issue, and I'll actually talk about some of the possible solutions in that regard. Security, like Ted said, is when I spoke at IoT Security in Boston last year, it was same consistent trending themes, which is even the larger firms are not executing on the fundamental 101. And it leaves a lot of backdoor and vulnerability, and especially with IoT, just like in the previous presentation you saw, it only takes a thermostat or some auxiliary device that's using Zigbee or Z-Wave or some outdated, antiquated protocol to be able to easily hack into that system because it's totally insecure. And then through that, they basically have a gateway into your entire system. So I'll just pause there and hand it over to Ted.
I won't be as nice as you were about describing the problem, I don't think. I guess I shouldn't say this about every organization, but most organizations that are building connected devices have taken this entire established body of knowledge about how to build systems in a secure manner, and if it's this beautiful book about how to do it, they've literally thrown the book out the window. And they've said, well, this is different. Consumers want X, Y, or Z, so we're going to get this to market. We need this feature. We have these limitations from a business standpoint. And quite honestly, I call bullshit on all of that. Because building a secure connected device is the exact same process as building any other type of system from a security perspective. All the same principles of secure design apply. And the reason that they're not being built into systems is because organizations are not prioritizing putting them in. It's not part of the build process. So, this question is really multiple questions because privacy and security are really different things. It's important to define and disambiguate the two. So, privacy is the ability for an individual to choose what happens with information about them. Security is the mechanism that ensures the effective performance of your mechanisms. And so there really are two different things, but what's really interesting is that both of them are problems when it comes to connected devices. Users don't know how their data is being used, they don't have control over it, and then even organizations who are promising that, hey, we're protecting your data, even though we're monetizing it and aggregating it in all these ways that you may or may not realize you accepted when you click, I accepted EULA, they're still getting compromised so that in ways that data is being accessed by organizations you didn't compromise.
So I think I would approach it from an example in how I spend my day. So I'm head of government affairs, so I do all the interactions with federal agencies, state agencies, but I also am the chief privacy officer, and I partner closely with the CISO and the entire organization on knocking the data down. But my activities are really spent on how we use the data and how we talk to the customer about how we use the data. And I actually think that's where there's an equal amount of opportunity to be innovative and actually help realize the IoT. We had slides today about what the IoT ecosystem could be worth. And I think that my privacy field has been for about 10 years or longer now talking about how data and trust are this competitive advantage. And I think that trying to realize that dream is how I spend my time. It's how we use the data, how we build a greater trust profile, which my colleagues who are worried about locking data down and developing products that are secure, yes, they're good to have those conversations, but it's not their primary function, right? They're trying to lock it down. I'm trying to work with consumers and business interests on how it gets used.
We could have a whole panel just on this one subject. First of all, I think that the reason why so many devices have so many attack planes that are unprotected is because the people who design them, that's not their area of expertise to begin with. In the industrial world, they're operational technology people. In the consumer world, they're designing for a price point, and they don't typically have the depth of security experience to even understand where you start. They're picking up standard OEM designs from chip vendors and implementing them, and then they're focusing on what's in the cloud and missing everything in between in terms of security. But I think also technology has blurred the line between what you own and what you generate in the course of using something. And I'll give you a great example. For those of you that watched the Super Bowl from inside the stadium, there were BLE devices all over Levi's Stadium that determined your exact location and then enabled the NFL broadcast to go to your smartphone. As soon as you left the stadium property and those BLE devices couldn't recognize your location, you were able to access NFL broadcasts. The location information was generated by the network as part of the delivery of video to you. Who owns your location? Is that owned by the Levi's Stadium? Is that owned by you personally where you have to authorize? That is it owned by the NFL. So the technology that allowed us to deliver real-time video replays to 27,000 fans simultaneously, that was the peak number during the Super Bowl. That also generated inferred information, which could be used, you could say, to violate your privacy because we knew wherever you moved within the stadium, but it also enabled features. So who owns that? And how do you give explicit permission? The cell phone company knows everywhere you move, and they always have since we started using cell phones. Who owns that? So I think we haven't yet even started delving into the legalities, much less all the sources of this inferred data that you're generating, and then who owns them when consent is explicitly required.
Very good questions, very good rhetorical questions. And what I've got as a follow-up to that, which I didn't realize how good this would fit, and I think it fits very good with, especially the last couple of comments, regulation versus best practices. One of the things that all of us in the industry are somewhat fearful of is getting regulations or undue regulations that are going to be very expensive and onerous and slow down innovation and so forth. So my next question to the panel is, how do you see best practices versus regulation fitting in? And just to kind of seed the question a little bit, to what extent do you think we as an industry in various ways can, in a sense, self-regulate ourselves by having best practices that we adopt and that we administer? So on this one, I'm going to start with Ted and go this way once again.
I think regulation, well, this is going to sound political maybe, but I think regulation is not good for any business whatsoever. So any industry that is potentially thinking about how do we travel a path that regulation is potentially going to be a stop on the ride, we should do whatever we can to avoid that, right? Regulation does stifle innovation. It, most importantly, regulation is usually pretty ineffective. It's usually years behind what is actually happening. And so you've got now a structure that forces an organization to react to something that's very outdated. A fantastic example is the healthcare industry, one of the most regulated industries on earth. And that whole industry, its entire mindset is about, we have to protect the patient record. But that's not really what's important. What's important is protecting patient health, stopping the ability for an adversary to attack a connected medical device that can harm a patient. But that's not where the priority is, because the regulation says you have to make sure that the medical record doesn't get stolen. So what I think organizations can do is start thinking about, well, how do we get out ahead of this so that there isn't constituents clamoring to Congress to say, hey, I need my connected devices better protected, you guys have to step in and do something. And I think the ways that industries can do that is by start going back to those basics and start thinking about the principles of secure design. And people often ask us when we're performing our security assessments, what are you looking at? Is there a framework that you follow? And we say there's not a framework, there's no point. What a framework is an attempt to codify or quantify principles of secure design, right? So we say, well, let's cut through the framework and go right to the point. And so every assessment that we look at, we're looking at things like how are privileges implemented as an example? How does a system consider authorization, authentication? Are those things built properly? And if organizations can think about, you made a really good point about, where does consent come in? When does the user choose whether or not a certain thing can capture a certain type of data? Thinking about that through the build process, those are going to be the kind of things that hopefully head off regulation. I apologize if there's any lawyers in the audience who really want to be part of that lawsuit for pursuing regulation.
Well, I probably agree with about half of that, the latter half. First off, I'm not a lawyer. I grew up in, my business background is, my exposures are, I should say, after college I was a naval officer and I used to have to monitor shaft and as an example, shaft bearing, function on an Aegis cruiser and have troops go down and do that. So the first thing I got exposed to, boy, it would be cool if more we could do it automated. And then early in my sales life, I worked in the healthcare industry. I used to carry a bag and sell prescription drugs. And then I moved into marketing and then got into corporate affairs, found myself into privacy because of wanting to work in the regulatory framework. I mean, I say all of that to offer back that I think the regulatory, I prefer best practices. I'm a free market person, but I think the regulatory framework, particularly in this space, has offered some helpful tools. For example, I mentioned that I work with federal agencies. I was recently out in PrivacyCon. That's an event held by the FTC. Some of you may be familiar with it. I thought it was a little, and I thought maybe missing from the conference was some attention played on all the good that comes out of these technology develops, all the use cases that were being satisfied. I thought that was missing from the conversation. But at the same time, good things come out and lead to frameworks that, how about security by design and the effort that regulators are doing both at the federal and the state level to bring about better understanding in innovators about some of the basic security principles. How about the important pressure? We'd like to think it happens naturally, but there is a certain regulatory pressure on companies like my own to be paying attention to the partners we bring on and what the skill set of those partners are. Now, we like to quickly move that over to best practices, but there's a regulatory framework there that plays a helpful role. Too much regulation, I'm happy to get up and combat it too, because I'm not trying to constrain freedom to operate, not trying to constrain innovation. But I think there's an important role for both. And I think what is important is that you have to engage in both spaces. That's kind of why I like the way we structure my department at ADT. As I said, we do privacy, but we also do external and government affairs. So we're a privacy office that talks to state attorney generals. We're a privacy office that talks to national or federal agencies. And I think that's an interesting approach, and we hope it's bringing value to our customers.
So I don't think there's any uniform definition of what privacy means for different people. And if you look across different generations, what people are willing to post on Facebook, for example, in the younger generation would be absolutely abhorrent to older citizens. And so when we talk about privacy, we need to define among ourselves, what do we consider private information? And it's going to vary. And we haven't had that discussion openly, I think, even in our society in general. So we keep going back and forth. We had a really interesting case in my company. We provide a lot of location-based tracking systems or monitoring systems for retailers. And Neiman Marcus and Nordstrom and so on. And there was a case where they're actually monitoring in the store what the travel paths were of people in the store. And at that time, iPhones and Androids, they'd all send out their Wi-Fi pings trying to find Wi-Fi networks, and the networks would pick it up, and we triangulate what was the origin of the smartphone that was saying, hey, what networks are nearby? And using that, you get a pretty good model of traffic flow in the store. Well, a partner, a vendor we were working with, put out a press release that basically said, we're tracking everybody that comes into this particular brand of retailer. And Senator Al Franken launched a congressional investigation into violation of privacy. Was it a violation of privacy? For many people, it was absolutely. It's important. How could they possibly know where I am? Not thinking that AT&T and Verizon and others always know where you are. And in others, I don't care. Maybe I'll get a better service. Maybe I'll get a coupon for a discount. So we haven't had that discussion yet about what privacy means. And once we've defined that, then I think we can put in place the terms that say, once you go over the line, we absolutely have to have regulations that are going to prevent that. But in other cases, we should let the market decide.
Very interesting. Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, I participated in a Forrester privacy study last year, and some of the findings that we collectively observed was that the notion of privacy means different things to different people. So the baby boomer and their reaction to privacy matters are going to be very grossly different from the millennials in particular. Moreover, there is a general momentum in the industry where there is a movement to regulate certain aspects. So for example, it's been some time where third-party data aggregators, if you think about it in the form of advertising, have been collecting a lot of information about you. And there has been a lot of supervision. And to the earlier point, there is some benefit to having some framework, some regulatory body framework that gives you some level of control and enforceability. But with that said, my position has always been privacy should not be a defensible position, but rather it should be an offensible position, meaning that you can actually use privacy to a comparative advantage in terms of positioning your firm. Because there are many wearables and IoT companies and data companies, and you'll start to see as we shift from kind of the sensors into the cloud and then the data analytics with AI and machine learning, people are going to be very concerned, and they want to know that you're doing this right, you're crunching the data and you're protecting the data. I'll give you some practical tips that I said I was going to insert. There is a startup coming out of MIT and Israel. What they're working on is a notion of a private data vault that uses secure multi-party computation. Basically what that means is they're able to encrypt the data pieces in these various nodes on the network and use differential privacy along with ways to basically strip out some of the privacy matters so it's processed. So the way it works is, one, they're amassing essentially a data vault, privacy data vault, that allows for all of you to opt in and share your data, saying, I trust them more than I trust Google or Apple or Samsung. And when that data resides with them, and companies like service providers want information, instead of taking your information from you, they send a query saying, who is authorized to come into this bar? Who is 21 and over? Rather than sending back a list of all your names and your DOB, they will just simply say, okay, here are normalized, kind of obfuscated information that you're looking for. Meaning, yes, this person is authorized to come into the bar because they're over 21, but they will not release information about your date of birth, about who you are. Let me give you another example. They're working with a bank, and one of the things that they have in terms of handicap is that the banks are limited in terms of how many transactional data they can actually look into for predictability around volume and sales and theft. So without actually having a look into the data itself, they're able to provide a layer that basically says, go and identify or solve this problem for me using this computational method, and returns a result. So essentially what you're getting back is a result or a model rather than the actual pure raw data itself. That's a very interesting model. Another one that I want to share with you, and I'll pass it over to the moderator, is there is an open source platform called OWN Cloud, OWN Cloud. And it's getting some pretty significant momentum. I think it's at, I have to look at my notes, I think about 8 million users, I believe, or more. But basically the way it works is it's very much like Dropbox, but it's actually a self-hosted file sharing syncing system for you. That's completely private. So instead of Dropbox, where the Dropbox themselves have access to all your files, all your data, including wearable data that you generate potentially, this is a private cloud that you manage, that you can place. Now what's really interesting is that that's from a server perspective. But now if you can think about placing something like that onto a device, so that watch, that wristband, that smart garment, that smart shoes, or the environmental BLE or the beacon types of things, and that data that it generates about you only resides there in an encrypted server-side form. That's very interesting. And the other thing that I'm going to bring up, which I'll elaborate in a little bit later, is the Linux project around the Hyperledger project, which has to do with blockchain.
Thank you, Scott. So those are some really good examples of some companies that are doing some very innovative things, which, bringing it back to the original question, may lead towards some best practices, perhaps not. I want to do a quick time check. Do we have till 12:30, Donna? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so since we're standing between you and lunch and we're kind of winding down, I think what I'd like to do at this point is turn it over to the audience for Q&A, because I want to make sure that if there's anything that they've said that you want them to elaborate on, or if you have a separate question, you get it in. So where's our first question?
In an industrial setting, if a large manufacturer or logistics, in an industrial setting, if a large manufacturer or logistics company is looking to put IoT sensors on their equipment, what is the best place to start looking into security? Is it more like when they're designing a new type of sensor that's going to do geolocation tracking and stuff like that, and end up, because they're going to have thousands of those and it's going to cost, the price of the sensor is going to go up? Or is it more like you get those devices enabled, it starts to get some data in, and then start to think about, okay, what is the most appropriate point of security and how do I want to secure this? I think just some guidelines on, in a typical project landscape, in a sponsor executive within a Fortune 500 company, where should they start?
Is your question directed towards anybody in particular, or?
No, not in general. I mean, anybody can jump in.
Go ahead.
Paul?
Tim, go ahead.
Paul's the turn.
That's a pretty straightforward answer. The earlier the better. So the reason I say that is, and by the way, it's important to note that it's never too early to start thinking about security, and it's never too late. A lot of organizations fall into the trap that they're in one of those two. The reason I say that the earlier the better is it delivers a couple of important benefits. So one is relating to cost, and one is relating to efficacy. So from a cost perspective, the effort to actually consider security and really investigate problems in a particular solution is about the same whether you do it at the beginning or at the end. It's roughly slightly less expensive to do it built in throughout, but the real cost savings comes in remediation. So if you think about building something, the other day I built a table, and I built it not in the room it was going to be in, and the table didn't fit through the door. So now I had to take the table apart, bring all the pieces back in through the door, and then rebuild it. So that was an example where I hadn't considered what was going to happen with this table after I built it, and it caused me extra pain that I had to invest in order to be able to use it. So it's the same idea when you're building a system. The remediation cost, which doesn't really show up on the bottom line, that's a real painful cost. The other is efficacy. As you're building something, considering something at each stage of the process in terms of what are the assets that you're trying to protect and who are the adversaries that are trying to attack it. Those are the things that will inform everything you're doing along the way so that the system is more resilient all throughout.
I would agree, and I would just simply say, I think since the topic of this is implementing things, I would suggest that whether it's a net application or even applications in our space, that be a part of senior decision-making checks from the very beginning. In fact, it should be factored into from the start, including budgeting and timing, because what will inevitably happen is the same thing that happens to businesses every day, is that if you don't do it up front, you still have to put the time in, but people will want to go to market, or in your case, you'll want to be able to extract the benefit of this monitoring. And then someone will say, well, we need to do this. And and then it'll fall into that, either people won't do it because they're so hungry for the implementation, or they want to go to market, or they'll blame the time having to be spent as a delay, when it really was just time that needed to be spent and incorporated in the process from the beginning. And if you can discipline yourself and your organization to do it from the start and get that be your cultural experience, I believe you'll have a, because this won't be the only time you have this consideration. It'll serve you better over time.
I think I can build on that. I think the reason why it's essential to do it at the beginning and open your aperture really wide is that it's the security of that infrastructure is more than just the infrastructure. There are going to be lots of other departments like personnel. Who's going to have access into that system and the records of it, the design of it, where the keys can be handled and stored that manage the encryption, for example. There are a lot of different elements that go into security that's not just the device that you're putting in, but everything that feeds into it and everywhere that the data can go, or where you can infer what's going on, say for an industrial process, to avoid espionage, for example. You might move way beyond that device to what maintenance people have access into the area, and am I going to use mobile device management to control the cameras on the smartphones when they come into an engineering area, so they won't take pictures of the plans. It's much broader consideration than just the devices themselves. So I think, to the earlier points, you have to do it right from the front.
Yeah, just real quick, what I was going to say is after agency interfaces with many of your types of companies, one of the things that we see is we reinvent the wheel very often. So we were actually a member of the Awesome Alliance. We actually initiated a open source study last year, and we've also evaluated Michael's organization as well. One of the things that's very important in terms of aligning yourself with other consortiums is not only interoperability, but some of the standards such as security and privacy and certification that comes with that as well. Moreover, I think one of the areas that I would highly recommend that you investigate is blockchain, trustless peer-to-peer messaging, decentralized, distributed, secure data, as well as the scalability. And again, with Linux and open source, like the Hyperledger project, it affords you a way to be able to scale quickly. Because the reality is, most of you, unless you're in a very specific privacy and security role, that isn't your core competency or your main focus. And same with you with your firms as well. So you need to figure out how to leverage what's already existing, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel every single time.
Any other questions?
Yeah, okay, sorry, a little bit of confusion there. So I'm curious, kind of, I guess this question's more for you, Bill, to the panel generally. Have you looked at any of the integrated development kits that are on the market from companies like M or Spark, now rebranded as Particle? I'm just curious to get a sense for companies that are trying to tackle a whole stack, with cloud service and IDE and the actual module. If you guys have looked at security vulnerabilities there. I'm by no means a security expert, I just know that it's a concern with every presentation we have to make.
Yeah, we have looked at some of the aspects, especially electric and they were involved with IoT Village. Off the top of my head, what I can do, I don't remember the details off the top of my head right now. What I can do is if afterwards you want to exchange cards, I can send you all the write-ups that we have on that information, and we can do it that way.
Thanks. All right, so I'm getting the signal here we need to wrap up because everybody's probably really hungry. And I'd like to thank everybody very much for being part of this panel and lots of good questions, and thank you very much to the panel.
And are we supposed to have lunch?
Yeah. I sent you an email. I'll go around to it.
Thanks.
Like on Monday.